so everybody's aware of that. And I want to welcome everybody. I am Danielle Miller, and I'm the director of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library. And I will be doing an introduction here, giving you a very brief overview of the library, and then turning the presentation over to John Pye, our audiobook production supervisor, and Alicia Ensminger, our assistant manager, and they're going to give you a great look at our audiobook production department and what happens with our books once they are completed. So the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, or as WTBBL, as we lovingly call it, and shorten our lengthy name to, is a program of the Washington State Library and also a regional library of the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled. And we sort of trace our roots to about 1906, when there were volunteers producing Braille out of the basement of a Seattle public library. And that service grew over the years. They actually got their first librarian for the blind in 1919. And then the library really came to being a full library in 1931, when there was an act of US Congress under President Hoover. It was called the Pratt-Smoot Act. And that act required the Library of Congress to provide library service to US residents unable to read standard print. And that was in large response to provide service to veterans, largely from World War I, who had lost their sight, mustard gas, and other impacts like that. And the Library of Congress knew they couldn't do that by themselves. So they set out to create a cooperative of network libraries. And WTBBL was one of the first 19 libraries in 1931. And at the time, we served also Alaska and Montana. Today, there are 55 regional libraries. There's one in every state. There are 2 in California, Florida, and New York. And then there is also service directly out of Washington, D.C., the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And today we only serve Washington State, but we do serve the entire state. And those who are eligible for service are people who are blind, visually impaired, have a physical disability that makes holding a book or turning a page difficult, which can include things like arthritis or neuropathy, cerebral palsy, Parkinson's, or if someone has a neurological reason that makes reading print difficult, or they may have a traumatic brain injury, and also people with reading disabilities, the most common being dyslexia. And we serve people of all ages, from birth with early literacy all the way to well over 100. I think we've got over 60 people who are actively using our services who are over 100 years old. We provide a number of services. We provide the core NLS services, which include signing up people for our service with an application which requires certification. And we provide the audiobooks, the digital talking books, the equipment that goes with them, playback equipment and accessories, Braille books, the national download site, which is called BARD, the Braille and Audio Reading Download. We administer and support Washington State. And then we also have a very robust youth services program, which has a youth services librarian, Erin Groth, a summer reading program, pen pal program, multi-sensory story time, and much more. We have readers advisors who are available all day long, providing great support to our patrons. We do extensive outreach, and we have an electronic services and instruction librarian who helps our patrons with assistive technology, learning how to download books and how to use our equipment. And we provide local instruction, local book production, pardon me. And we do that in Braille, and we also do that in audio, and that's what we're going to focus on here. And our audiobook production department first started in 1975 and was originally called the Evergreen Taping Services. So why do we produce audiobooks? We produce them to increase access. And access is so critical to our patrons. There's a statistic out there that says people who are unable to read standard print have access only to about 3% of the published print materials that you or I would have access to as print readers. And we want to improve that access and improve the accessibility for our readers. And in addition to not being able to have access to those materials, many of our patrons, I think there's somebody who might not be muted. Thank you very much. We want to be able to be sure they can access their books. For many people, they may not be able to physically get to the library. Often people say, well, why don't they just use commercial audiobooks? Well, in the 30s, commercial audiobooks didn't exist, and they weren't the popular thing they are now. So we've been doing this for a long time, for one. Two, even now, people may not be able to get to the library. They may not be able to get to the bookstore. They may not have the technology needed to be able to use the commercial audiobooks. About 70% of our patrons are over the age of 65. 30% of those are over 85, and many are living in retirement homes or care facilities or on fixed income, don't have access to the internet, so they may not have the ability to be using things like Overdrive or Libby. Even with CDs, they may not be able to tell which CD is which, or they may not be driving around in a car listening to audiobooks that way. So we're creating books that are accessible. They're in a format that can be used. We have the equipment they can use, and they can go straight to their door. So we're creating audiobooks that are accessible and going straight to the patron. And we support creating books that supplement the National Library Service collection that's provided to us. And that collection is primarily a public library type collection. So we focus on Northwest materials. We produce books that are about the Northwest, set in the Northwest, or by Northwest authors. And we have a collection development committee that's made up of our librarians, and we take recommendations from our readers' advisors, from other staff, and recommendations from patrons. And we evaluate those under our collection development policy, and we're able to produce materials operating under the Marrakesh Treaty, which is an international copyright agreement. And that allows us to produce books without getting any copyright permission from the author or publisher or paying any copyright fees, as long as the books we produce are in an alternate format and only go out to people who have print disabilities. Once we identify a book that we want to produce, we purchase that book, or in some cases get it from the library, and we catalog the book and prepare it for publication or for production. And then we pass it on to the audiobook production department. And that's where John can tell you about what happens in the life cycle of that book. John, you want to take it from here?
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending this presentation. As you can see here on the slide, there's a number of books that we've actually have produced. The overview for us for the audiobook production area is that, you know, we go through an audition process, we train volunteers, we teach them how to do recording, and other volunteers how to do reviewing. There's a review and edit process, and then we actually get all the books ready to circulate, which sounds like a very, you know, basic, quick process, but it's actually a very, very involved process for us because we actually have quite a large production that we encounter with our production. Just a few stats here. As you can see, Zuala Diaz here enjoying one of her books on an iPad. We have about 11 audio booths in production, about 15 volunteer reviewers, over about 80 to 100 volunteer narrators, about 350 books in process at any one moment. So all of these are in different, you know, points of production, whether they're being recorded, reviewed, edited, or uploaded, final editing. There's a lot of steps along the way. There's 10,000 audio hours of audio produced a year, 200 audio books per year, and about 208,000 circulated downloads since 2009, and all with just 3 department staff. Of course, we do have the volunteers who make up a lion's share of the production for us. Now, the first step for audio production, I mean, we kind of are in a very unique situation because we have a very large operation, and we've kind of actually set this up, and it's designed to maximize production and maintain quality control. So people are working kind of like more in silos in virtual production, because in the traditional sense, how you produce audiobooks is you would have a narrator, you would have a reviewer who's in the other room listening, and then you would have an audio engineer running equipment, basically kind of recording the material, allowing the narrator and the reviewer free rein and concentrating on the material. We've actually kind of separated all that out into individual tasks so that the narrator is recording the book on their own. Reviewer gets the book after the narrator records the book, and then the engineer is more involved with all the editing of the material to go back and forth between individuals, as well as to keep the books moving along. This actually maximizes our capabilities with over 350 book productions, that we can always keep the same narrator involved, the same reviewer involved with reviewing the book, and it gives it that consistency and quality control, so that as a reviewer goes through a book of a specific narrator, they actually are very attuned to maybe, you know, habits or maybe other things that one narrator does, so they can actually pick up material that may be incorrect more quickly. On the average, it takes about a year to produce a title with all the steps involved. So that's why we always kind of keep a lot of books in process, because it takes a while for us to do it, but actually we do crank out a lot as we continue to go along. The first step in the audio production is the audition process after the books have been, you know, chosen by the collection committee. In this screenshot here, you have part of the audition committee, Sandra Driscoll and Stacy Thurston, along with myself. I'm usually just a facilitator. We also include either Shannon or Alan, our readers advisors, in on the audition committee as well too, because they have a lot of great insight about what is needed for a narrator. And it's very eye-opening for me, because I actually did a lot of audio prior to this, radio work and, you know, commercial audio work for video shoots and everything else. And so my idea of what a good narrator could be was a little bit different from what I learned from the committee. Basically, the desired traits are, you know, pretty obviously clear and expressive voice quality, and one of the big things is through over dramatization or over interpretation, keeping a really good natural pace. You know, articulation is very important. Using the actual punctuation, because basically, if you read material utilizing the punctuation as presented, it actually reads very well. And moving your voice only when necessary. So basically, that was kind of a little bit more of an eye-opener for me, as opposed to, you know, having the, you might say, the voice of God or the big, you know, sounding basso Fernando voice coming through as the narrator. It was very interesting to kind of learn about the qualities that really kind of are more essential for this. And ergo, this is how we actually do look for in our prospective volunteers the skills that they have. So the audition process is basically, it's actually kind of a pretty involved process. We give prospective readers material that day that they have to review for 20 minutes. So they are actually doing a cold read for us. We do auditions about 3 times a year, basically to keep the funnel the amount of narrators through for us, to keep us fresh and keep the number of new people coming through to replace possibly people who may be moving on. The audition comprises 4 or 5 sections, actually. There's a section about a nonfiction piece. There's a news piece. There's actually a fiction piece, vocabulary list, and some section for them to bring in their own material to record. They start the recording. They go 20 minutes straight through. The material we record, we gather, and then we go through the committee to listen. We have maybe about a 50% success rate, and even within the success rate of passing those people, we actually have to do quite a bit of training because everybody has to come through with specific training to build up their reading stamina, and also to the particular, you might say, skills we like to enforce with our narrators, because our narrators are also not only the voice, but they also are the first editors for the audio files that are produced. So once a volunteer gets through the audition process, they're kind of basically told that they can come in and do the training. The training process is actually up to about 4 to 6 weeks. And basically during this time, we kind of get them very well acquainted with the software, audio editing software. SoundForge is the new platform that we're introducing. We've used Adobe Audition in the past. We teach the narrators to use the software in a very basic need-to-know basis about record yourself, put down markers to indicate where you may have made a mistake, and stop recording. Basically, that's it. And then we also show them how to edit out their material, because when we have them trained for the recording, we actually have them read. If they make a mistake, they put down a marker. They reread the material right away at the moment, so they keep their reading momentum up, and they just keep on going. At the end of their session for the day, they'll come back and edit out all the material that is not correct, ergo leaving the material that they've already recorded that's correct. This is bypassing the whole need of kind of coming back and trying to re-record something later on. Because even 20 minutes later, if you try to record something, it's not going to actually really match that well. So if you make a mistake, re-record the material that you made the mistake with and just keep on going. You keep your reading momentum going. You keep your, your errors in a very kind of manageable manner. Other things we teach the narrators at this point, we're also trying to build up their reading stamina. So in the 4 to 6 weeks that we go through this training, we, obviously give them samples of existing narrators they listen to. We also utilize different types of material. So every week they'll have to record something that is either nonfiction, maybe a memoir or a historic piece. We'll actually also give them some fantasy, mystery, romance, westerns, young adult stuff, the gamut. So basically within this 4 to 6 week period, we can also figure out where their strengths lie, so that when we do start having them record and produce books for us, we want to start them off first with something they can feel more comfortable with, number one. Number two, also give them something short and accomplishable, so that they can actually finish the book in a timely fashion and have a sense of finality with that, and sense of production. So we kind of mentor them along this 4 to 6 week process in this audition section. Actually, should change the slide. It's actually narrative training. So continuing with the training, we also kind of train reviewers who don't actually, are kind of set up to be able to review the files. They're actually also trained to be able to read along and listen to the files and make marks and annotations as well too. So in the whole process of recording, some best practices that we actually do is that we all have the volunteers pre-read the material, create a pronunciation guide if they have for names, and if it's a fiction piece, to look through and try to get specific names of places and terminology. The best practices we try to incorporate is the fact that even though they have built up their reading stamina for 4 to 6 weeks, that we actually try to cap it for a session of reading for 35 minutes. Because we found that after 35 minutes, everyone, no matter what their skill level, no matter what history they have for reading out loud, presentations, they actually start making more mistakes after 35 minutes. So it becomes a law of diminishing returns. We look at body mechanics. Hydration is important. Mic placement is important when we set them up to record. And then they're kind of able to do their process, put down their markers. They record the material, make markers if they have a mistake. You record the material right away. And then afterwards, their sessions, they finish recording, and then they edit their material, remove the material that's incorrect out of the files. Over the course of the recording of the books, they amass all these audio files. We try to keep them always in the same booth, because even though we have equipment that's pretty much the same in every room, with the same software, it's very different sometimes with background noise and actually air movement in the room. So we try to kind of cut our losses to basically not have people move from space to space, because that does change some of the stuff. Here in this slide here for the recording one is one of our longtime readers, Sarah Pittman. She and her actually husband come in every week to record in the evening. So once it goes through recording, we have the review and edit process. And on this slide, you can see Greg Porter here actually kind of looking at one of his files, highlighting some of the audio material and getting ready to probably cut it out. The editing process is actually one where a reviewer who's been trained, and of course the reviewers go through a training process too, as I mentioned. Basically, the editor compiles all the files from, that's the staff editor does, compiles all the files from the narrator into 60 to 80 minute chunks. They normalize the audio, repair any editorial issues through editing, because basically we want to have the reviewer spend 60 to 80 minutes max reviewing a file, because again, through a lot of our metrics, we've discovered that after 60 minutes of listening to some audio and reading along, you will start maybe not hearing many mistakes, or you may start kind of glossing over mistakes, or you maybe start listening and saying, oh, well, that adjective was in there, or that preposition was in there, when it basically wasn't. So for the reviewer, we cap it off at 60 to 80 minutes and have them kind of come back after that. They basically use the same marking system that the narrators use, and that's how we communicate between editor, narrator, and reviewer, is through this marking system with annotation. They'll mark in the book if there's an issue with a sentence, a word, transposed word, maybe perhaps punctuation that is not correctly utilized, wrong emphasis on different parts of the sentences. A lot of things happen. A lot of times people add words, drop words. Many things can happen in the booth as well too, as far as like audio hits or sounds of clicking from the mouse. So all of these things our reviewers actually go through and yet for us. In fact, here on this next slide, you can see an audio file with about 100 markers in there. This has been a very diligent reviewer who's actually looked through the material. As you can see, there's annotation for a description on different pages about what was wrong, whether something was missing. I don't know if you can see it very clearly on this, but when this says sit and o and everything else. So they're very, very, very particular, our reviewers, about what's kind of not sufficient or not good to have in there. So the editors get this material, and you may think that, oh my God, this is a lot of markers. It is a lot of markers, and this is probably the worst case scenario. A lot of our readers may end up with maybe on average 50 to 60 markers, or maybe 30 markers in an audio file. Some surprisingly really have less than that, but this doesn't mean that our narrator is a poor narrator. It's just that there's things that happen. This file comes back to us in editing, and the editors remove or fix through editing what they can. And you can see we've eliminated quite a number of different markers, so that now the markers that are remaining are ones that we actually add space to, so that we can actually have the narrator come back and record into these spaces. And when this material goes back to the narrator, they basically listen to the material, kind of match their voices, and then record into the space. We usually leave about enough space for them to record something 2 to 3 times, and they can also still edit that material within that space. They're not the final editor for this, so at that point, once they insert their audio into these spaces, it comes back to the staff editor. We go through material, edit all the corrections into it, basically check on the audio itself because it's a post record, so we have to make sure that it matches. And then we go through and sound sweeten the whole file, basically also getting rid of any overdriven material, background noise, sound sweeten it, and then we actually prep the material to be what we call hard limited, so that we can actually minimize the highs and the lows, so that in a audio reproduction we can actually hear things more clearly on a mono signal. So once we have gotten all these files prepped, the book then goes to our, you might say, our closer, who actually, as another staff editor, Bonnie Brown, she actually marks up the book through Hindenburg, another software, audio software that's been kind of repurposed and specialized to actually add audio navigation points, so that by putting these audio navigation points in there, our patrons can navigate an audio file back and forth through either a point that's a contents introduction or maybe a chapter beginning. Cookbooks, we've actually had audio markers for ingredients, process, everything else, so they can go flip back and forth between different sections of the book just by navigating on the player. And the player will recognize these navigation points that we are putting into the software Hindenburg. Hindenburg is also another new software that we've incorporated into our process, replacing one that was called Book Wizard. And basically, it increased our production from where Book Wizard was very slow and very laborious in using, and it was also very uncompromising if you made a mistake. You had to pretty much start over a whole book from the beginning if you made some type of error within the metadata. So with Hindenburg, it's much more of a facile, much more reactive software that it changed our metric from a book a week to a book a day that we could upload. And so Hindenburg itself can put the markers in, and there's also a function of it in it that we can actually encrypt the book so that it'll be properly set so that it's protected when it's uploaded to the NLS site. So in this finalization process, we add navigation markers through the Hindenburg software, add metadata information, audio information as well, and the encryption. And then we upload it to the NLS site, transfer files and bibliographic information to NLS for using the upload portal, communicate with NLS. They have to kind of give us indication that everything's fine on their end. And then all the information is added to BARD, the kind of cataloging system, so that the book becomes alive. And then the book goes on to duplication on demand and also for download. So I also at this point wanted to actually just give some examples of the voices that we do have. This slide shows Anita Akakar. She was a volunteer with us but has moved on, but she is actually recording a young adult book, which she actually was allowed to use a little bit more inflection and a little bit more use of voice to actually basically bring out the material. So I'm going to play this sample a bit, and then I have a few more after this too.
The next morning, on Kali Kaudash, Scar arrives early. We're up, but haven't started work. We scramble to set up our trays. But he comes up the ladder quickly. "You filthy, ungrateful pigs! You haven't started work yet!" He twists Sahil's ear and slaps him. Then he turns to me. "You are the smart one. You should know better than to waste your time, Gopal." He jerks my arm behind my back and twists it. The pain shoots up to my shoulders. I bite my lip to stop a scream. He looks at me. "Keep an eye on them. I want the work done and done right. If any one of them messes up, you will get a beating that you will never forget." I want to hit him over the head with the bead tray. If we had all done that as he came up the ladder, he would have collapsed. Why didn't I plan the attack with my friends last night?
So, as I mentioned before, we try to always try to give a clean reading. We try to also discourage narrators from necessarily using accents, voices, unless they actually are able to use the accent or basically are culturally, specifically attuned to that. So there was kind of one incident where we had somebody recording a book about Apollo Ono, and unfortunately the narrator initially started to give his father, who's an Asian American or Japanese American dad, a heavy Japanese accent, which he couldn't maintain because eventually it started morphing into an Italian accent. So we always try to tell people, if you really can, don't do accents, just do alliteration. But if you can, I mean, and there are some of our volunteers, which I'll speak about later, who actually are voice coaches for theatrical productions and know a lot about accents and voices that, we try to steer clear from that. This next narrator that I have is basically Maya Quicksall. She's actually, she came to us when she was 14 years old. She's actually the daughter of one of our other longtime narrators, Rachel Glass. Rachel also does the voters pamphlet for us and a voice of many, many books. But Maya came to us and she was a very good reader. It's very difficult sometimes to have teen readers because there's a lot of time that they, don't have. They're very busy in school. And one of the other big things we found out about adolescent readers, and we had a few of them at the time, and we still do, is the fact that within the course of a book that's being produced, it's usually about a year. Voices change when you're an adolescent very quickly. So when Maya came back to do her corrections on this book, or this sample, which is from Paper Moon, she actually had to really kind of listen to how she sounded, and she was She did sound a lot different, but she was able to match it very well.
Longboy always liked to brag that we finally got too big for Alabama. But that's not completely true. In fact, I don't reckon there's any truth in it at all. I've always felt we probably could have gone on doing business in Alabama for the rest of our lives if Longboy hadn't made a big fool of himself over Miss Trixie Delight. It's sure a fact that if Longboy hadn't been showing off in front of Trixie, he never would have bought a fancy yellow car that was as conspicuous as two turds in a punch bowl. Maybe if he hadn't been mooning over Trixie, we never would have landed in the mess that made us run for the state line.
Okay, and the next person here coming up is Bob Carlson, who actually has been a long-time volunteer with us. He actually started up with us in radio. He's probably one of the best cold readers of news that I ever ran across. I mean, you could just pick up the morning paper and just start reading, and there'd be no problems with any type of incorrections or anything like that. So, oops, lost myself here. Let me just go back and so.
It was a moment worthy of his skills, and his skills were worthy of the moment. With both prescience and poise, he classically laid out the myriad possibilities in only a few words. At the moment the smooth, sweet swing of Edgar Martinez turned potential energy kinetic, Dave Niehaus rose to his beloved Mariner's greatest moment with perhaps his greatest call. It was not only the jubilant explosion of 19 seasons of pent-up frustration, it was the joyous eruption of 2 decades of unending hope and unyielding faith that this moment would come.
Yeah, Bob has a very nice kind of sports-related voice and very matter-of-fact. And for my final actually example is Angela Wynn, who actually did the Seattle Reads book for us, the Best We Could Do. And this is from an excerpt from Listen Slowly.
I am a Laguna Beach girl who can paddleboard one-legged and live on fish tacos and mango smoothies. My parents should be thanking the Buddha for a daughter like me. A no lip gloss, no short shorts 12-year-old, rocking a 4.0 GPA and an SAT-ish vocab, who is team leader in track, science, and chess. I should at least be able to spend the summer resting my brain at the beach. Instead, I get shoved on this pre-dawn flight. My parents slapped me with the news just last night when I was floaty and happy because 6th grade was finally over. I was thinking summer vacation, sunsets, bonfires, but no. With buggy eyes and stretchy smiles, they cooed out the news that I get to escort Dad's mom back to Vietnam for 6 whole weeks.
So, Angela actually also, for that book that we had to do last year, The Best We Could Do, we actually produced that book on a much faster time frame. We actually did that in about a month and a half, because basically we were actually on a timeline to get the book produced for our patrons because it was the Seattle Reads book. And we almost were also able to get an interview with the author, but that kind of didn't fall through some scheduling issues. And finally, I just wanted to mention something about our volunteers. You know, we have an amazing array of volunteers. It's a diverse group. It's very dedicated readers. Diversity is reflective in their skills and ability to tackle the multitude of titles that are across the board, very diverse, very involved, some very, very, very thick material. And, you know, they're very, they come from all walks. There's actors, radio announcers, voice coaches, lawyers and legal assistants, software engineers, service industry people, as well as King County workers, teachers, landscape architects, and librarians. So it's a pretty amazing group of individuals, as well as a number of retired individuals. They all come with very dedicated spirits, and they also are kind of very unique. A lot of the volunteers are very hard on themselves. I've caught some files where they fully didn't edit out all their mistakes, and there's a lot of cursing and like, oh God, whatever. And I've also heard a lot of volunteers trying to revamp and build up their stamina again and doing push-ups in the room next door. And they do a lot of exhaustive research on the material. There's one of our volunteers, she actually did a lot of work with Native American tribes around here and created a glossary for us for a number of different publications that we would have a very difficult time finding the research for that because it's not even published. We basically had to actually find individuals to help us with that situation, and that was through our volunteer base. So kudos to our volunteers, and they make up about 3.5 FTE, about 7,000 hours of work that they produced for us in 2019.
Okay, can you guys hear me all right? No?
Do I have
Yes.
audio?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon,
Yeah.
everyone. I'm going to pick up here where John left off. And as we talk about audio production and how our books are locally produced, the final step in that life cycle is circulations. And what I mean by circulations is the process of getting these incredible audiobooks to our patrons both across the state as well as across the country. And our library circulates talking books in two ways. Books can be delivered by postage-free mail, or books can be downloaded from the National Library Service's Braille and audio reading download site. That's a mouthful. It's BARD for short. And what BARD is, it's a website and a mobile app to download our talking books. So let's start with talking about BARD a bit here. It's our electronic circulations, and all of the network libraries have access to BARD. It's really wonderful. It gives our patrons in Washington as well as patrons across the country access to thousands of audio and Braille books, magazines, and even music scores. And how this works is qualified patrons register for service at Watauble. They're given a user account to BARD, and there's a web-based portal called BARD Express, which enables patrons to actually download the mobile version, or which is an app for Android, iOS, and Kindle Fire devices. And from there, patrons can access the full collection of digital audiobooks anytime, as often as they want, and they can keep the books. There really isn't a return policy. Now, when we complete a book in our local production department, as John was talking about, Watauble staff submit the book for upload to BARD, so patrons all over the country can download them. And we actually post an impressive book a day. So one audiobook per day is posted by Watauble staff. And I think we can go ahead and move to the next slide, John. So this is our physical circulation or physical access to audiobooks. So when patrons sign up for service, Watauble staff create a profile of preferences based on favorite subjects or authors, favorite series, and we use that to select books through our library management system. And these books are the physical cartridges from the national collection as well as our local collection that live in Watauble's shipping department. So what I'm really talking about is our physical library in Seattle when I mention our physical circulation. And how this works is that all the materials are sent in the mail to patrons using Free Matter for the Blind designation. And from there, our books are distributed around the state. So I don't know if everyone used or maybe just remembered Netflix mail service with the CDs back in the day. You would sign up to receive movies from Netflix, wait a few days to receive your CDs in the mail, watch the movies, send them back, and the cycle would continue. Well, that's basically our current service model for physical books. And we like to say that we're the original Netflix. It's very effective at serving patrons across the entire state, so we've been using that. Oh, I see a comment. I still have that. I love that. Thank you. um, and for the next slide here, I just want to show you real quick. Give John a minute to change the slide. There it goes. Okay. We have an example of what that player looks like. Physical cartridges are inserted into the front of the player, and the player has the standard playback capability. So volume, forward, backwards, play, stop, even sleep. And just to be clear about this, all registered Watauble patrons are eligible to access talking books through both the mail and the download service. They can choose, and we do have patrons who choose both, but surveys have shown that almost about half of Watauble's patrons don't use the internet, which creates a barrier to accessing the online collection of Bard. And that has big implications for us. And we can go ahead to the next slide. And it gets more complicated. We found that patrons who borrow talking books through the mail have access to approximately half the titles from Bard, plus longer wait times to receive their books because that content is moving through the mail. So really what becomes apparent in our current circulation models is this issue of the digital divide. The physical and digital service models are not equitable, but the incredible staff at Watauble have been working really hard to remedy this, and we're really working to provide equal access to all of our resources, which brings us to duplication on demand. And the current goal is that by spring or early summer, we're not really sure right now, Watauble will be partnering with NLS, our parent organization, to find a better way to circulate our physical audiobooks, those cartridges. Soon, our wonderful staff in shipping will have new hardware and new software to be able to download multiple audiobooks onto a single cartridge and then mail the cartridge to the patron's home. And this is a big improvement for us. In the photo on the left here, you can see an example of what physical cartridges look like today. Currently, we have one book per one cartridge. This duplication on demand service model, it gives patrons an opportunity to have about 7 books per one cartridge. So that single book to single cartridge model will disappear. And the goal is that patrons always have a book to listen to with this. Thinking back to that Netflix model, ideally one cartridge will be with the patron, while another one of their cartridges will be in the mail, and a third cartridge will be at the library getting books loaded on it. So that's an ideal situation, but ultimately there's a more evenly distributed flow of books to those patrons who receive their audiobooks in the mail. And there's a little more to this. Duplication on demand is so exciting because it means that all of our digital audiobooks in that NLS collection will be available. It's a closer service experience to Bard. But we are not slackers at Watauble. For the last year and a half or so, we've been piloting the patron-centric cartridges. We call them PCCs, which is essentially the beta version of duplication on demand service, which we call DoD. Lots of acronyms for you this afternoon. And like duplication on demand, patron-centric cartridges allow us to load multiple books on that single cartridge. But it's not a completely automated process, and it's rather labor intensive. But in doing this testing with several hundred patrons, we were able to confirm that this is the right way to go. It works. It works for our people. And it's an excellent alternative for patrons who, for whatever reason, may not be able to download books themselves through Bard. And final thoughts about this. As we move into implementing duplication on demand this spring and summer, we are ultimately reinventing our physical circulations, and we're providing a way to get more of those local audiobooks to more of our patrons. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for me, John, or Danielle?
Thank you, Alicia and John. That was excellent.
It was excellent. And I just want to understand that if you all did not have volunteers, it seems to me we could not afford to have this service, certainly not at the rate that we create audiobooks now. Is that true?
Cindy, that is absolutely true. And altogether, I think volunteers give us almost, all told, probably 12 or 13 FTE. We have over 200 narrators each year. Not narrators, 200 volunteers total each year. I mean, 100 of those are in the audiobook production department, but we've got volunteers in the Braille department. We have amazing volunteers in the shipping department, volunteers that work with the readers advisors, with youth services, in reader services, volunteers in every department of the library. And they're incredible. And we couldn't do nearly what we do in any part of the library without the volunteers. So they're just incredible. And I saw, I'm going to go to the chat. Anna asked if volunteers ever request books by a specific narrator. I know in the past there was a narrator, Scorpy, Alan might have to help me out with this, who was very popular, but I know if patrons sometimes say they don't want a specific narrator. That's one of the things that patrons can do. Alicia mentioned that when we sign people up or when we talk to them, we help create their profile. The other part of that is craft exclusions for them, things that they don't want to receive. And so people can say they don't want a specific narrator. Or if people are maybe hard of hearing, sometimes that higher register of a woman's voice can be hard for them. So they might say they don't want to receive books with female narrators. But there are narrators that people like, and they can request a specific narrator. Let's see. Have any of your voice actors ever used their Watabo portfolios to break into a paid work of audiobook creation? I know people do practice at Watabo. John, do you know if anyone has done that?
You know, there's a few that have moved on, or actually not necessarily moved on. Several of them still record for us. So there was one during Teresa's time, Kate. She went on to produce and do her own book recording.
Kate Fleming, right?
Kate Fleming, yeah. But yes, there's been a fair amount of readers. I mean, it used to be that people would come to us and say, oh, we want to practice, we want to do this. And a lot of those individuals sometimes go by the wayside because they're not really there to necessarily volunteer to record books for the patrons. But the ones who do maintain this intensity and kind of can straddle both worlds have actually, there's been a handful of people who've done it fairly successfully. So that's all I can say right now.
And I think John, he made it clear that with the Seattle Reads book, that producing it in a month was a pretty phenomenal anomaly. That was really a lot of cards aligning and a lot of really hard work on the part of the narrator and John and the staff in the audiobook production department, because an average book will take a year to produce. And this 4 to 6 weeks to train a narrator, it's really a commitment. And we ask and hope that the narrators and the reviewers will make that commitment to us. Because if somebody leaves partway through a book, then we have to start over, and it's a lot of work and a lot of hands and a lot of people that are involved in the production. So someone just coming in to kind of try out and experiment or get a little practice is not ideal.
Well, as a testament to our volunteer structure here at the library, we have probably some of the best retention of volunteers that I know of nonprofits and other organizations. So the volunteer coordinator and we do a great job of keeping everybody involved, and everybody is a part of it. We have volunteer activities. We have thank you, seminars, and we try to give some workshops to them, and so we always try to keep that as an something for the volunteers, because frankly speaking, I too actually work or volunteer for other organizations, and I realized the lack of sometimes volunteer services where it's not necessarily always being thanked, but it's also there's a certain feeling of inclusion that you're part of something that it's really pretty big, important, and they are. So, and we always make them feel that. So.
Yeah, we have volunteers that have been with us for 30 years or longer, and many that stay. And I think John does an incredible job connecting with the volunteers and spending time talking to them and getting to know them, as do all the staff. And as he mentioned, as does our volunteer services manager. So I think that really helps. They're not just coming in to do a job. Tien, yes, the sped up time for the book production has not affected the quality of the books produced. That's very true. It hasn't affected the quality, and the upload per day, it's not. It's the software has much better capacity. It's not a reduction in quality at all. Do you want to say anything about that, Alicia, about Hindenburg? Book Wizard that we were using was a very difficult and persnickety software that made working with things very, very difficult. And Hindenburg is a much, much better product.
Yeah, it took about a week to add those markers into the old software. So we're in a much better place in having implemented Hindenburg last year. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. There are any other questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap up. We really appreciate you spending your hour with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Toodaloo.
Thank you.
Thank you.